She thought she had escaped the past, but the past wasn't done with her yet. Homeless and desperate, Olivia swore she'd never rely on anyone again. But when an old classmate from years ago offers a second chance, will she take it, or let pride push her back into the darkness? Stay with us to uncover her incredible journey of love, redemption, and the fight for a future worth believing in. The city lights of Atlanta shimmered through Logan Bennett's windshield as he drove down the nearly deserted streets. It was a crisp autumn night, the kind where the air held a chill just sharp enough to bite through a man's suit. Logan adjusted the heat in his car and rubbed his temples. It had been a long day of negotiations, meetings, and sealing deals, but none of it mattered now. He was just eager to get home and sink into the comfort of solitude. Then something caught his eye. A woman sat hunched on the sidewalk, her arms wrapped around two small figures. At first, he thought it was just another unfortunate soul caught in the relentless grip of poverty. But as he slowed down for a closer look, realization struck like a punch to the gut. It was Olivia Carter. His heart stuttered in his chest. Olivia, the girl who once laughed at him in high school, the girl who never spared him a second glance except to mock his hand-me-down clothes and nervous stammer. Now she sat on the cold pavement, her hair unkempt, her once bright eyes dulled by exhaustion and hardship. Beside her, two little girls huddled for warmth, their tiny frames wrapped in threadbare coats. One of them, Harper, he later learned, rubbed her sleepy eyes and whimpered. "Shh, sweetheart," Olivia whispered, pulling the child closer. "Everything's going to be okay." Logan swallowed hard. He could have kept driving. He should have. This wasn't his problem. But something inside him refused to let go. He pulled over and stepped out of his car, his expensive leather shoes clicking against the pavement. "Olivia?" His voice was hesitant, unsure. She flinched at the sound of his voice and slowly looked up. Recognition flickered in her eyes, followed by something he hadn't expected. Shame. "Logan?" she croaked, her voice rough from the cold. A beat of silence stretched between them. Logan took in the sight of her. Thin, pale, visibly drained. This wasn't the same confident, radiant girl from high school. Life had been cruel to her. "What happened to you?" he asked softly, taking a cautious step forward. Her arms tightened around the twins, a protective instinct flashing across her face. "It doesn't matter," she murmured. "We're fine." Logan wasn't convinced, not when Harper let out a quiet sob, and her sister Hazel clung to Olivia's arm with wide, fearful eyes. "You're not fine." His tone was firmer now, edged with concern. "Let me help." "No," Olivia snapped, shaking her head. "We don't need charity." Logan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "This isn't charity. You have two little girls shivering in the cold. Let me take you somewhere safe." Olivia looked torn, her pride battling her desperation. Then, as if on cue, Harper's stomach let out a loud, pitiful growl. Olivia closed her eyes, her shoulders slumping. "Mommy, I'm hungry," Harper whispered, her voice barely audible. That was it. Logan made the decision for her. "Come with me," he said, softer now. "You can't stay out here." Still, she hesitated. Logan saw it in her eyes, the distrust, the fear. He couldn't blame her. In her position, he would have felt the same. But then Hazel tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Please, Mommy," she pleaded. Something in Olivia broke. With a deep breath, she nodded. "Okay." Logan exhaled in relief. He opened the car door, waiting as Olivia gathered her daughters and climbed inside. The warmth of the car hit them immediately, and the twins huddled together in the back seat, their eyelids drooping with exhaustion. As Logan pulled away from the curb, Olivia stared out the window, her expression unreadable. He could only imagine what she was thinking. Had she made the right choice? Or had she just walked into another mistake? Logan stole a glance at her, then at the two fragile souls in the back seat. No, he wouldn't let her regret this. He wouldn't abandon them. As the city faded into the background and his mansion loomed ahead, he silently vowed, whatever it took, he would help them. Olivia woke up to an unfamiliar sensation, warmth. For a moment, she was suspended between reality and a dream, her body sinking into the plush mattress beneath her. The scent of freshly brewed coffee drifted through the air, and the sound of soft footsteps echoed down the hallway. She blinked against the soft golden light filtering through the curtains, her mind sluggishly catching up to where she was. Logan Bennett's house. The realization sent a jolt through her. She sat up quickly, her pulse hammering in her ears. This wasn't right. She shouldn't be here. The last thing she needed was to be indebted to Logan. Him of all people. Swinging her legs over the side of the bed, she rubbed her arms, still dressed in the same worn-out sweater from the night before. The air in the room was warm, so different from the bone-chilling nights spent on the cold pavement. She could hear the faint murmur of voices from outside the room, and her chest tightened. The girls. Olivia shot up and opened the bedroom door, following the sound of familiar giggles. She found them in the grand dining room, seated at a long mahogany table that looked like it belonged in a palace. Hazel and Harper sat across from each other, their tiny hands wrapped around silver spoons as they eagerly devoured bowls of warm oatmeal. A woman, probably in her 60s, stood nearby with a kind smile, carefully watching over them. "Oh, good morning, dear," the woman greeted as soon as she noticed Olivia standing in the doorway, uncertain and tense. "The girls are just finishing up their breakfast. They were quite the hungry little ones." Olivia swallowed, feeling a surge of guilt. "They shouldn't be eating all your food," she said stiffly. The woman chuckled. "Nonsense. There's plenty to go around. I'm Mrs. Harper, by the way." She wiped her hands on her apron and gave Olivia a once-over, as if assessing her with motherly concern. "You must be Olivia." Olivia nodded hesitantly. The woman radiated warmth, reminding her of the kindness she hadn't experienced in years. But she couldn't let herself get comfortable. This wasn't her home. Before she could say another word, Logan entered the room, his usual composed expression giving away little. He was dressed in a crisp button-down and slacks, looking every bit the successful businessman she remembered from news articles and social media. His gaze flickered toward Olivia before settling on the twins, softening for a brief moment. "They seem happy," he remarked, watching as Harper licked a bit of oatmeal off her spoon. "That's good." "They don't know any better," Olivia muttered, arms crossing over her chest. Logan's jaw tightened at her tone, but he let it go. "You should eat," he said, motioning toward the remaining plates of food. "Mrs. Harper made extra." "I'm fine." "You're not." Her eyes snapped up to his, meeting his unwavering gaze. He had always been like this, even back in high school, determined, unreadable, infuriatingly persistent. But she wasn't the same girl anymore. She had nothing left of that version of herself. Harper and Hazel giggled again, drawing Olivia's attention. They looked content for the first time in forever. She should be happy about that, but instead it made her stomach twist. "They're getting too comfortable. This isn't real." "Eat, Olivia," Mrs. Harper urged gently. "You need to keep your strength up." "I don't need handouts," she shot back, her voice sharper than intended. Silence settled over the room. Logan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's not a handout, it's food." She looked away. The fight in her was dimming under exhaustion, but pride was a hard thing to let go of. They finished breakfast in silence. Olivia barely touched her plate, but the twins ate every last bite, unaware of the quiet tension in the air. That evening, after settling the girls into their borrowed beds, Olivia sat on the edge of the mattress in the room Logan had given her. She stared at the wall, her mind running in endless circles. She had to leave. It didn't matter that the bed was the most comfortable thing she'd slept in for years. It didn't matter that Logan had been patient, too patient, despite her resistance. She wasn't a charity case. But when she looked over at Harper and Hazel, curled up under thick blankets with peaceful faces, the thought of dragging them back into the cold felt unbearable. Still, what was her alternative? Stay here and rely on Logan? The same Logan she had once mocked and dismissed as insignificant in their teenage years? The irony stung. Torn between survival and her pride, she exhaled shakily. "One more night, then we'll leave." Meanwhile, in his office, Logan leaned back in his chair, staring at his laptop screen. The Olivia Carter he remembered was gone. This woman, this guarded, exhausted version of her, was someone else entirely, and he wanted to know why. Typing quickly, he pulled up the records he had requested. A deep frown formed as he scanned through them. Jake Holloway, the man Olivia refused to talk about. Logan shut his laptop with a quiet thud, his mind already made up. He would find out the truth. The first rays of sunlight barely pierced through the thick gray clouds as Olivia folded the small borrowed sweater she had given Hazel the night before. The house was still eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made every sound she made seem deafening. Her hands trembled as she stuffed what little she had into an old canvas bag. Her daughters were still sleeping, their small bodies curled together on the plush bed, so different from the cold, hard surfaces they had become accustomed to. She should have felt relief being in a warm, safe place. Instead, she felt trapped. Olivia's breath hitched as she glanced toward the bedroom door, half expecting Logan to be standing there, arms crossed, waiting to stop her. But the hallway remained empty. She had spent too many years relying on herself to let someone like Logan Bennett, a man who had never known real hardship, dictate her life. She gently shook Harper and Hazel awake. "Come on, girls, we have to go." Hazel rubbed her eyes, yawning. "Go where, Mommy?" "Somewhere else," Olivia answered quickly, hoisting the bag over her shoulder. "Come on, baby." They didn't ask more questions, just like they hadn't the night before. They had learned long ago that sometimes Mommy didn't have answers. She tiptoed down the grand hallway, clutching Harper's tiny hand while Hazel dragged her favorite stuffed bear against the polished floor. The mansion felt too big, too opulent. She had spent the night feeling suffocated by its luxury. She made it to the staircase without incident. Just a few more steps, and they'd be out. But then a voice stopped her in her tracks. "You're really going to do this?" Olivia turned slowly, already knowing who it was. Logan stood near the entrance to his office, his arms folded across his chest, his expression unreadable. The dim morning light cast sharp angles on his face. His dark eyes locked onto her like he was waiting for her to explain herself. "I don't belong here," Olivia whispered. Logan exhaled, shaking his head. "You don't have anywhere else to go." "I'll figure it out," she shot back, gripping Harper's hand tighter. Logan stepped closer. "Olivia, this isn't about charity. It's about safety. You and the girls have nowhere to be, no money, no plan." "I'll find something," she insisted. "I always do." He ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. "And if you don't?" She lifted her chin. "Then that's my problem." A tense silence stretched between them. Finally, Logan sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "At least let me help you make a plan. A job, an apartment, something." Her fingers curled into her palm. She wanted to accept, to say yes, because deep down she knew he was right. But every instinct in her told her that taking help from Logan Bennett was a mistake. He was the boy she had laughed at in high school, the one she had never thought twice about. And now he was standing in front of her, looking at her like she was a puzzle he needed to solve. "I can't." Her voice cracked. Logan studied her for a moment before stepping aside, leaving the path to the front door open. "If you change your mind," he said quietly, "you know where to find me." Olivia swallowed hard, hesitating for just a moment before leading her daughters toward the exit. She had almost made it when Harper looked up at her with wide, trusting eyes and asked, "Mommy, where will we sleep tonight?" Olivia's steps faltered. The weight of the question pressed against her chest like a heavy stone. For a brief second, she considered turning around, but then she pushed the doubt away and stepped out into the cold morning air. Logan didn't try to stop her. Instead, he watched from the doorway as Olivia and her daughters disappeared down the long driveway, their silhouettes growing smaller with each step. He clenched his jaw. He knew better than to force someone to accept help they weren't ready for. But that didn't mean he wouldn't be there when she finally realized she needed it. Hours later, as Olivia walked the unfamiliar streets, the weight of her decision settled in her chest. She had been so determined to leave that she hadn't thought about what would come next. The sky darkened, the temperature dropping with each passing hour. She pulled her daughters closer, their small bodies shivering against her. She had made a mistake. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the bitter chill of the night. Olivia tightened her grip around her daughters, pulling them closer against her body in a feeble attempt to shield them from the cold. The park bench beneath her was hard and unforgiving. its metal frame radiating the night's frigid air. Hazel curled against her side, her tiny hands clutching Olivia's coat, while Harper stirred in her lap, letting out a soft whimper. The city was still alive in the distance, honking cars, the occasional siren wailing in the night. But none of it mattered here. Here, in the dark recesses of the park, Olivia felt completely alone. A few figures lay curled on distant benches, lost in their own struggles, their faces hidden beneath layers of ragged blankets. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the pavement, making everything feel even colder. She had made a mistake. The thought crept into her mind like an unwelcome intruder, whispering truths she wasn't ready to face. She had walked away from safety, from warmth, from a man who, despite her past with him, had only shown her kindness. And for what? Pride, fear, the need to prove she could do this on her own? She clenched her jaw, pushing the thoughts aside. It didn't matter. She had made her choice. Now she had to live with it. A rustling sound drew her attention. Across the park, a woman emerged from the shadows, wrapped in an oversized coat, her hands deep in her pockets. She wasn't homeless. Olivia could tell that much. Her clothes were worn but not tattered, her shoes sturdy, her face lined with concern rather than exhaustion. "You shouldn't be out here with little ones," the woman said softly as she approached. Olivia stiffened. "We're fine." The woman studied her, her gaze flickering to the sleeping girls. "They don't look fine." Olivia's arms instinctively tightened around her daughters. "I appreciate your concern, but we're managing." The woman hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small paper sack. "Here," she said, extending it toward Olivia. "It's just a sandwich and some fruit. Nothing much, but it's fresh." The scent of food hit Olivia instantly, making her stomach twist painfully. It had been too long since she'd eaten properly. But still, she hesitated. Accepting charity meant accepting failure, and she had promised herself she wouldn't do that, not again. She started, but her voice caught. As if sensing her hesitation, Harper stirred in her lap, her tiny voice barely above a whisper. "Mommy, hungry." A lump formed in Olivia's throat. The woman must have heard it too. "Please," she urged. "For them." Swallowing her pride, Olivia reached out and took the bag. "Thank you," she murmured, barely able to look the woman in the eye. The woman offered a small, understanding nod. "There's a shelter a few blocks from here. They take in families, no questions asked. You'd be safe there." Olivia shook her head. I can't." She didn't need a shelter. She didn't need another place that made her feel like a failure. But as the night stretched on, her daughters growing colder and more restless, she wondered if she was wrong. Harper coughed, a soft, dry sound that sent panic straight through Olivia's chest. She pressed a hand to her daughter's forehead, cool now, but she knew how quickly that could change. Fear gripped her. What if Harper got sick? Really sick? What if she couldn't take care of them out here? She had been so determined to prove she could survive on her own, but what if that determination cost her daughters everything? The thought made her breath hitch. She looked down at them, so small, so innocent, trusting her to keep them safe. And in that moment, Olivia knew what she had to do. With shaking hands, she adjusted Hazel's coat, then carefully lifted Harper into her arms. She ignored the sting of humiliation as she stood, her legs weak from the long hours of sitting in the cold. There was only one place she could go, one person she had to face. As she walked through the empty streets, her mind raced with uncertainty. Would Logan even let her back in? She had walked away without a second thought. What reason did he have to trust she wouldn't do it again? Her pride screamed at her to turn back, to find another way. But then Harper coughed again, a pitiful, raspy sound that tore at Olivia's heart. No, she couldn't afford pride anymore. She just hoped she wasn't too late. The mansion loomed in the distance, its warm lights glowing against the darkness. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping onto the porch and knocking. The door opened almost instantly. Logan stood there, his expression unreadable. Olivia's heart pounded. She started, but the words stuck in her throat. She had no excuses, no explanations. All she had was the silent plea in her eyes. Would he let her in? Or had she burned her last chance? The night was colder than Olivia had anticipated. The wind slipped through the gaps in her thin coat, biting into her skin as she tightened her arms around her daughters. Hazel was curled against her chest, her breath warm but uneven, while Harper lay beside her on the bench, her small body shivering even beneath Olivia's makeshift embrace. The park was nearly empty, save for a few homeless individuals huddled under blankets in the distance. A nearby street lamp flickered, casting an eerie glow over the cracked pavement. Beyond the trees, the city's lights pulsed with life, people in warm homes filled with food and laughter, utterly oblivious to the woman sitting in the shadows with her children. She had made a mistake. The thought gnawed at her, the same way the cold gnawed at her bones. She had walked away from safety, from warmth, from the one person who had offered her help without asking for anything in return. And now she was here, desperate, exhausted, and on the verge of breaking. Hazel stirred, murmuring something unintelligible before pressing her face against Olivia's shoulder. Harper, on the other hand, was still. Too still. "Harper?" Olivia whispered, gently brushing her fingers against her daughter's forehead. A wave of panic rushed through her as she felt the slight heat beneath her touch. "No, not now." "Mommy?" Hazel's voice was groggy, thick with sleep. "It's okay, baby," Olivia lied, tucking the coat tighter around them. She wasn't sure how much longer they could last out here. Footsteps sounded in the distance. Olivia stiffened, her instincts screaming at her to be alert. A figure approached, a woman bundled in a heavy coat, her face partially hidden beneath the hood. Olivia braced herself, unsure if she should flee or stay put. "You shouldn't be out here with children," the woman said softly. Olivia clenched her jaw. "We're fine." The woman's eyes flickered with something. Sympathy, maybe. "I doubt that." Olivia shifted, positioning her body between the stranger and her daughters. "We don't need help," the woman sighed. "Look, I don't mean to intrude, but I've been where you are." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small paper sack. "It's just some food. You don't have to take it, but I'd feel better knowing they ate." The smell of fresh bread and something sweet hit Olivia immediately, making her stomach cramp with hunger. She wanted to refuse. She wanted to hold on to the last shred of dignity she had left. But Harper whimpered softly, her fingers clutching at Olivia's coat, and that was all it took. Swallowing her pride, Olivia reached out and took the bag. "Thank you." The woman nodded, as if she understood the weight of those two simple words. "There's a shelter a few blocks from here. They'll take you in. No questions, no judgments." Olivia stiffened. "I can't." "Why not?" Because going to a shelter would be admitting she had failed. Because she wasn't ready to be just another statistic, another homeless mother begging for a place to stay. Because she still had the illusion, however foolish, that she could fix this on her own. I can't," Olivia said again, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "All right, just take care of them." She gave one last glance at the girls before walking away, disappearing into the shadows. Olivia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She opened the bag, pulling out a sandwich and a small apple. Hazel stirred again, her sleepy eyes blinking open as the smell of food reached her. "Mommy?" she murmured. "Here, baby." Olivia broke off a piece of the sandwich and placed it in Hazel's tiny hands. She did the same for Harper, though her eldest was still too drowsy to eat much. For a few moments it was enough, but then Harper coughed, a dry, weak sound that sent a fresh wave of panic through Olivia. She pressed a hand to her daughter's forehead again, still warm, too warm. The signs of an oncoming fever were unmistakable. Her heart pounded. What was she doing? She had let her pride drive her out here, and now Harper was sick. She had made the wrong choice. For the first time since leaving Logan's house, Olivia felt true fear. If Harper's fever got worse, if she couldn't keep her warm, if she got too sick. No, she couldn't let that happen. She had to do something. She had to go back. Tears burned in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She carefully lifted Harper into her arms and pulled Hazel close, wrapping them both as tightly as she could in her coat. Then, with her heart pounding and her pride shattered, she stood and started walking. The journey back to Logan's house felt endless. Her legs ached, her arms were heavy, and every step felt like it carried the weight of her failure. She had no idea what she would say to him, no idea if he would even let her back in. But she had no choice. By the time she reached his doorstep, the night had deepened, and exhaustion weighed her down like a boulder. She hesitated for only a second before raising her hand and knocking. The door opened almost immediately. Logan stood there, his expression unreadable. Olivia's breath caught. She had nothing left. No excuses, no defenses, only desperation. "Please," she whispered. Would he let her in? Or had she burned her last chance? Olivia sat at the dining table, staring blankly at the steaming cup of tea in front of her. Logan's mansion was warm, comforting even, yet she couldn't shake the unease twisting in her stomach. She had spent the past few nights in the safety of these walls, watching her daughters sleep peacefully. But that peace was an illusion. Her past had caught up with her, and now she was at war. Across from her, Logan observed her in silence. His jaw was tight, his fingers drumming against the edge of his chair. He had promised to help, but Olivia knew he was walking on eggshells around her, afraid to push too hard. "We'll fight this," Logan finally said, his voice steady. Olivia let out a bitter laugh. "Fight?" She shook her head. "Jake has lawyers, connections, money." Her voice wavered. "And I have, what, a history of being homeless?" "You have me," Logan replied firmly. "And now you have Richard Blake." At the mention of the name, Olivia turned toward the doorway, where a tall, silver-haired man in a perfectly tailored suit stood. His eyes were sharp, analytical, as if he had already sized her up in mere seconds. "Miss Carter," Richard greeted her, stepping forward. "I've reviewed your case, and while your ex is clearly grasping at straws, we need to be strategic. Custody battles aren't just about truth, they're about perception." Olivia swallowed hard. "And what does that mean for me?" "It means we fight back with the truth," Richard said, placing a thick file on the table. "And we make sure that truth is heard." The court summons arrived the next morning, and Olivia's hands trembled as she held the papers. Jake Miller versus Olivia Carter. He was suing for full custody, claiming she was an unfit mother due to her financial instability. "He doesn't even want them," Olivia muttered to Logan that evening, pacing in the study. "This isn't about Harper and Hazel, it's about control. He just wants to win." Logan's gaze darkened. "Then we make sure he doesn't." But Olivia wasn't naive. Jake wouldn't be above using underhanded tactics. He had always been good at manipulating people, twisting the truth until it suited his needs. She wasn't just fighting for custody. She was fighting against a man who had never played fair. Days passed in a blur of legal meetings and court preparations. Olivia spent hours with Richard, going over every aspect of her life, her past struggles, her attempts to find stability, the moments that could be used against her. She hated reliving it all, but she had no choice. And then, the court date arrived. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Jake sat across from her, his polished appearance a far cry from the man she once knew. His smirk was infuriating, as if he had already won. Olivia's hands clenched in her lap as his lawyer stood. "Your Honor, my client seeks custody on the grounds that Miss Carter is unable to provide a stable home for her children. The facts speak for themselves. She was homeless, without employment, and incapable of securing proper care." Whispers rippled through the courtroom. Olivia felt sick. Richard stood unfazed. And yet here she is today. Not homeless, not incapable. My client has done everything in her power to protect her children. Can the same be said about the plaintiff? Jake's lawyer smirked. "We have proof that Miss Carter is irresponsible. Witnesses will testify to her reckless choices." As if on cue, the screen in the courtroom flickered to life, displaying grainy security footage. Olivia's breath caught as she recognized the scene. Her, rushing out of a convenience store late one night, her daughters in tow. The footage had no sound, but it was clear she had been struggling. "She has a history of poor decision-making," Jake's lawyer continued. "Do we really want to risk these children's well-being?" Panic surged in Olivia's chest. "They're twisting everything." Richard leaned over. "Trust me." Taking a deep breath, Olivia forced herself to stay composed as Richard stood. "Your Honor, the plaintiff claims my client is reckless, but I'd like to present something in return." He handed a stack of documents to the judge. "This is a record of Jake Miller's financial transactions over the past year. You'll notice several large withdrawals from his account, one of which, coincidentally, matches the exact amount his lawyer was paid. Now ask yourselves, if he truly wanted to support his children, why hasn't he provided a single cent in child support? Jake's smirk faltered. Richard turned to the judge. Furthermore, we have multiple statements from those who have actually seen Miss Carter with her daughters. Teachers, neighbors, even employees from shelters who have praised her dedication as a mother. The judge's gaze hardened as he glanced at Jake. Mr. Miller, do you have an explanation for these financial records? Jake shifted uncomfortably. I had expenses. Richard didn't even hide his smirk. Of course. The tide was turning. Olivia could feel it. Jake's frustration boiled over. He stood suddenly, voice raised. She's lying. She's always been a liar. The judge's gavel slammed. Mr. Miller, control yourself. But Jake wasn't done. He turned to Olivia, eyes burning with rage. You think this is over? You think you've won? Logan, who had been silent all morning, stood abruptly. Sit down, Jake. The courtroom grew silent. Jake clenched his fists but finally sank into his chair. The damage was done. His outburst had sealed his fate. The judge sighed. This court will reconvene after further deliberation. As Olivia exited the courtroom, she felt Logan's hand on her back, a steadying presence. You did good, he murmured. But Olivia wasn't sure. The battle wasn't over yet. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. Olivia sat stiffly in her chair, her fingers gripping the edges of the polished wooden table. The walls seemed to close in on her as she listened to the final arguments, her heart pounding like a war drum inside her chest. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered slightly, adding to her growing unease. Something didn't feel right. Across the room, Jake sat smugly, his legs crossed in a posture of absolute confidence. He leaned back lazily in his chair, flashing her a smirk. It wasn't the expression of a man on the verge of losing. No, it was something else. Olivia's stomach churned with a sickening realization. Jake knew something she didn't. Richard Blake, her lawyer, was still speaking, his voice steady and firm as he outlined the overwhelming evidence proving Olivia's ability to provide a safe and stable life for her daughters. The case had seemed airtight. Logan had spared no expense in gathering documents, testimonials, and expert witnesses who attested to Olivia's strength as a mother. Everything had been leading up to this moment, yet Olivia could feel the shift in the air. Something was coming. Jake shifted in his seat, and then, as if on cue, his attorney stood up with a sly smile. Your Honor, we have a surprise witness, the attorney announced. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Olivia turned sharply toward Richard, whose normally composed expression darkened. Logan tensed beside her, his jaw clenching. This is unexpected, the judge said, adjusting his glasses. Who is this witness? The doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and Olivia's breath caught in her throat. A woman entered, dressed professionally, her heels clicking against the floor as she strode toward the witness stand. At first, Olivia didn't recognize her. Then the realization hit her like a freight train. It was Dana Caldwell, her former landlord, the woman who had once allowed Olivia to stay in a rundown apartment when she had nowhere else to go. Olivia hadn't seen or heard from her in years. But why was she here now? Jake's lawyer wasted no time. Miss Caldwell, can you confirm to the court that Olivia Carter was a reckless and irresponsible tenant? Olivia's mouth went dry. That's a lie, she whispered, shaking her head. Dana adjusted the microphone. Yes, I can confirm, she said smoothly. I had to evict Miss Carter for failing to pay rent multiple times, and when she left, she trashed the apartment. Holes in the walls, unpaid utilities. It was a disaster. Olivia shot up from her seat. That's not true, she blurted. The judge banged his gavel. Miss Carter, you will remain seated. Her hands trembled as she lowered herself back into the chair. Her vision blurred. Panic clawed at her throat. She had left the apartment in perfect condition. She had scrubbed the floors with her bare hands, desperate to leave on good terms. How could Dana stand there and lie so easily? She's been paid off, Logan muttered beside her. Olivia turned to him, her pulse racing. What? I'd bet everything I have that Jake got to her first, Logan said. His voice was calm, but his blue eyes burned with fury. This was his plan all along. Richard immediately stood to object, challenging the credibility of Dana's claims, but Olivia barely heard anything. The walls of the courtroom seemed to close in on her, and suddenly she wasn't there anymore. She was back in that tiny apartment, back when she was running on nothing but desperation, back when she had pleaded with Dana for just a few more days, but the woman had refused to give her more time. Back when she had carried her daughters out into the night, feeling like the worst mother in the world. And now, because of Dana's lies, she could lose them forever. The trial was slipping through her fingers. Her hands clenched into fists on her lap as she tried to force air into her lungs. She felt Logan's hand close over hers under the table, warm and steady, grounding her. She turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze. He gave her a small nod, silent reassurance in the storm of her panic. "Breathe, Olivia. Don't let him win." The judge called for a recess to review the new testimony. Olivia rose shakily, her legs unsteady beneath her. As they exited the courtroom, Logan's hand remained firm at her back, guiding her through the corridor. "I'm losing," Olivia choked out as they stepped outside into the cool air. "This is it. He's winning." Logan stopped and turned her toward him. His expression softened. "No, you are not losing." Tears burned at the corners of her eyes. "Logan, did you hear her? She's lying and they're going to believe her." "They won't." Logan's voice was steady, unwavering. "You have Richard, you have evidence, and you have me. No matter what happens in there, you are not alone." Olivia swallowed hard, her heart pounding against her ribs. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. But Jake wasn't finished yet. She could feel it. As they turned to go back inside, the weight of the coming verdict settled over her like a heavy storm cloud. Whatever happened next, it would change everything. The room was silent, except for the sound of shuffling papers as the judge took their seat at the bench. The anticipation in the air was suffocating. Olivia could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, her hands clammy as she clutched them together. She sat rigidly beside Logan, her body tense, her breath shallow. This was it. This was the moment that would determine whether she would finally be free from Jake, or if he would manage to sink his claws into her life once more. Logan reached under the table, taking her trembling hand into his. His touch was steady, firm, a silent reminder that she wasn't alone. She stole a quick glance at him. He gave her a reassuring nod, his deep brown eyes filled with quiet strength. He had been her pillar through this battle. But now, everything rested in the hands of the judge sitting in front of them. Across the courtroom, Jake lounged in his chair, a self-satisfied smirk plastered on his face. His attorney sat beside him, whispering something, but he hardly seemed to be listening. He had already made up his mind. He had won. The judge cleared their throat, and the murmuring in the courtroom ceased. "The court has reviewed all presented evidence, including testimony from both parties. And after careful deliberation, we have reached a decision regarding the custody of Harper and Hazel Miller," the judge began, their voice firm and measured. Olivia's breath hitched. She tightened her grip on Logan's hand, bracing herself for the worst. "As it stands, the claims made by Mr. Miller regarding Miss Carter's ability to provide a stable environment for her children have been found unsubstantiated. Furthermore, evidence has been presented that indicates a pattern of neglect on Mr. Miller's part, as well as financial motivations for seeking custody." Jake's smirk faltered. His attorney's face darkened, but they remained silent. "Therefore," the judge continued, looking directly at Olivia, "this court rules in favor of Miss Carter. Full legal and physical custody of Harper and Hazel Carter shall remain with their mother. Additionally, given the circumstances and Mr. Miller's outburst in the previous hearing, a restraining order is issued, barring Mr. Miller from contacting Miss Carter or the children in any capacity without legal mediation." The courtroom remained silent for half a second before Jake shot to his feet. "What?" His voice boomed through the room. His attorney hissed something at him, likely warning him to stay quiet. But Jake had lost all composure. His smug confidence had been shattered, his victory ripped from his grasp. He slammed his hands onto the table, his face twisting into something ugly. "This is a joke," he yelled. "She's a homeless... Mr. Miller." The judge's voice cut through the room like a sharp blade. "You will remain silent, or I will hold you in contempt of court." Security officers moved toward him, ready to intervene. "She's lying, she's..." 2 officers grabbed him by the arms, pulling him back. Jake struggled, his face turning red with fury, but no one came to his defense, not even his lawyer. For the first time, Olivia saw him for what he truly was. Not an untouchable force, not an invincible monster, but just a man. A desperate, powerless man who had lost. The weight she had carried for years, fear, guilt, shame, lifted slightly. She wasn't fully free yet, but this was a start. She barely registered the gavel slamming down, signaling the court's decision was final. The moment the judge stood to leave, Olivia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands trembled violently as she tried to process what had just happened. It was over. She had won. A sob tore through her chest, and before she knew it, Logan was beside her, pulling her into his arms. She didn't resist. She couldn't. She buried her face into his shoulder, letting herself break down. "It's okay," Logan murmured against her hair. "It's over now. You're safe." She clung to him, waves of relief and exhaustion washing over her. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid. Logan held her for as long as she needed, his arms unwavering, his presence grounding her in the moment. When she finally pulled back, her face streaked with tears, he brushed a thumb across her cheek. "You did it, Olivia," he said softly. "You fought for them, and you won." She nodded, still unable to form words, her emotions raw. From the corner of her eye, she saw Jake being escorted out of the courtroom, his rage still palpable. But it no longer had any power over her. Her daughters were safe. She was safe. As they stepped out of the courtroom, the sun shone brightly through the windows, filling the hallway with golden light. It felt surreal, almost poetic, like the darkness was finally giving way to something better. But even as relief settled in, a quiet doubt lingered in the back of her mind. Logan had been her protector, her rock. But could she allow herself to truly let him in? As if sensing her thoughts, Logan squeezed her hand, his expression unreadable. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's go home." She followed him, but deep down, she knew she still had one more battle left. One against the walls she had built around her heart. And Logan was ready to tear them down. The garden shimmered under the soft glow of hanging lanterns, their warm light casting golden hues against the darkening sky. The evening air carried the faint scent of roses and freshly cut grass, a soothing contrast to the storm of emotions brewing inside Olivia Carter. Across from her, Logan Bennett sat with a quiet intensity, his fingers idly tracing the rim of his wine glass. He had been uncharacteristically reserved all evening, speaking only in short, clipped sentences. His usual effortless confidence seemed muted, replaced by something that felt almost like hesitation. Something was different about tonight. She studied him carefully, trying to decipher the source of his tension. He had never been one to shy away from confrontation, and yet, here he was. A man who commanded boardrooms and million-dollar deals, looking as though he was about to step off the edge of a cliff. "You're awfully quiet," Olivia said finally, breaking the silence. "Not like you at all." Logan exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, well, I've got a lot on my mind." She set down her fork, her appetite long forgotten. "Want to talk about it?" A slow, almost reluctant smile tugged at the corner of his lips, but there was something uncertain in his expression. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "You know," he said, his voice softer now, "when I brought you and the girls back into my life, I didn't expect everything to change. But it did. You changed everything." Olivia swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words settle deep inside her. She wasn't sure she was ready for where this conversation was heading. Logan reached into his pocket, his movements deliberate. When his hand emerged, she saw the small black velvet box resting against his palm, and suddenly the world seemed to tilt on its axis, her breath caught. "Olivia," he said, standing up and moving around the table. Slowly, he lowered himself onto one knee. "I never thought I'd be the kind of man who needed more than success. I thought love was a distraction, something that complicated things. But then you walked back into my life and everything I thought I knew changed." The night air pressed in around them. the sounds of crickets and distant city lights fading into the background. Olivia's fingers curled around the edges of her napkin, gripping it like a lifeline. "I've watched you fight for your daughters, for yourself," Logan continued. "You've been through hell and back, and yet you stand here stronger than ever. You don't need saving, Olivia, but I want to be the one standing beside you no matter what comes next." He flipped open the box, revealing a simple yet stunning diamond ring that sparkled in the dim glow of the lanterns. "Marry me." The words echoed through the quiet garden, settling heavily between them. Olivia's heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Her mind screamed at her to say yes, to finally let herself believe in a love that wasn't fleeting, that wasn't tied to pain. But there was a lingering fear, an old wound that refused to heal completely. She had loved before, and love had failed her. Her past whispered warnings, reminding her of the broken promises, the shattered dreams. But then she looked at Logan, at the unwavering certainty in his eyes, at the way he knelt before her, patient, steady, waiting. This was different. Logan was different. Tears stung her eyes, blurring her vision as she let out a shaky breath. The words lodged in her throat, stuck between the ghosts of yesterday and the hope of tomorrow. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she whispered, "Yes." For a moment, Logan didn't move, as if making sure he had heard her right. Then his face broke into an expression of pure relief, and before she could react, he was on his feet, pulling her into his arms. His warmth enveloped her, grounding her in the reality of this moment. "You have no idea how long I've wanted to hear you say that," he murmured against her hair. Olivia let out a laugh, though it was more of a breathless exhale. "I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to." "You don't have to be sure of anything," he said, tilting her chin up so their eyes met. "You just have to trust me." And for the first time in a long time, she thought maybe she could. Months later, Olivia stood at the altar, the weight of her past finally lifting like the morning mist. The garden was decorated with white roses and soft candlelight, the air thick with the scent of fresh blooms and the faint sound of a violin playing in the background. Harper and Hazel, dressed in matching flower girl dresses, giggled as they scattered petals down the aisle, their joy infectious. Logan stood at the end of the aisle waiting. Olivia's breath caught at the sight of him. He looked at her the way he always had, like she was something worth fighting for, like she was his world. She had spent so much of her life running, afraid of what love could do, of how it could shatter and leave nothing behind. But standing here now in front of the man who had seen every broken piece of her and still chose to stay, she knew she wasn't running anymore. She had fought for this moment, for this life, and she had won. As she reached Logan, his fingers laced through hers, steady and warm. "You ready?" he whispered. She smiled, squeezing his hand. "I've never been more ready for anything." And as they exchanged vows, as they promised forever beneath the soft glow of the evening sky, Olivia let go of the past. All that remained was the future, their future, together. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey. Through Olivia's struggles and triumphs, we've been reminded that resilience is not just about standing strong. Sometimes it's about knowing when to accept help. Her story is one of courage, growth, and ultimately the realization that love and trust can heal even the deepest wounds. Life often tests us in ways we never expect. Whether it's fighting for our loved ones, learning to let go of past fears, or daring to embrace a new beginning, we all face moments where we must decide between staying in our comfort zone or stepping into the unknown. Olivia chose to fight, not just for herself, but for her daughters. And in doing so, she found something even greater, a future filled with love and hope. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice that changed your life? We'd love to hear your story. Leave a comment below and let us know where you're tuning in from. If this story touched your heart, type 1 in the comments. And if there's something you'd change about Olivia's journey, share your thoughts. We value your perspective. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more inspiring stories that connect with your heart. Thank you for being here, and we can't wait to see you in our next story.